I've signed in and when Dr. Asunta's email ID because another meeting is going on in my computer. So I had to come up to the other side. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Now, dear participants, the next session is going to be given by Dr. Anthony, sir. He will introduce himself before he starts his lecture. And he currently works as associate professor in Shastra Engineering College. Now over to Anthony, sir.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Can you upload your presentation, sir?
Yes, I'm doing it, ma'am, now. I'll just do it. Okay, so thank you very much. I thank Professor Juliet for giving me this opportunity to present, give this presentation. So I'm Anthony Arulraj. I'm an associate professor in School of Chemical and Biotechnology, Shastra University. Actually, my interest is in materials. I do lots of experiments using large-scale facilities, particularly with emphasis of doing structure property correlations in functional oxides and so on. But today, because I also have interest in MEMS and nanofabrication techniques, so it was a happy situation, and I thought I'll just participate in this FDP. So let me just start with what I intend to present today. Now, what I'm going to do is I briefly give an overview of MEMS, micro electromechanical system, and then just summarize some topics related to MEMS as we go ahead, related to the nanotechnology in some way. Also, an interesting aspect where there's some pointers to what one can do for himself if he's interested to make a particular MEMS, for example. There are some literature on it, and I'm sure that in this FDP you would have already had some information on this. I will then focus on an overview of some relevant nanofabrication techniques. Pick one example where you make use of MEMS so that you could carry out a particular scientific research, design a nanoscale device for scientific research. And I'll end with slide description of some of my interest in research, and some example where I have an interest to make use of MEMS and nanofabrication technique in relation to the research that I'll be describing a little bit at the end. So this will be really a very sketchy overview of MEMS. So MEMS, the microelectromechanical system, is a system that consists of a small scale electrical and mechanical components so that a specific purpose can be carried out. And mainly these MEMS are made using techniques of microfabrication. These components in MEMS, this could be include electrical component or mechanical component, or it could have some other components as well, like for example, a radio frequency device or any nanostructural device or an optical device. Essentially, this is a system where these components, which are devices, actually sensors and actuators, which are coupled to the microelectronics forming the MEMS device. Now, we know that MEMS technology is referred in different names in some different parts of the globe. For example, MEMS technology is referred to as microsystems technology in Europe. In Japan, they simply call it micro machines. And depending on the components that is included and the application that is desired, MEMS can have different names. For example, it could be called micro optoelectromechanical system if there is an optical application associated with that particular MEMS, or if there is a radio frequency component in the MEMS, you can simply call it RF MEMS. It's done so. There is also the nano electromechanical system, NEMS. If any structural component of this MEMS have a dimension which is, let's say, less than or equal to roughly around 100 nanometer. So if you have such a component in a MEMS, you can simply call it as a nano electromechanical system. Also, if you find that the MEMS has use in bio-related application, has bio-related material, like for example, DNA strand. This is used to detect decide targets or to manipulate cell. Then such a MEM, you can simply call it bio-MEMS. Now, the dimension of this MEMS can vary, and this can be sometimes below a micron, or it could be maybe several millimeters. So this is roughly the dimensions of MEMS device that you will find. And one finds that the sensitivity of these MEMS devices is considerably high. And this sensitivity is mainly coming because the length scale to which the MEMS device is responding is very close to, let's say, a crystalline structure length scale. If the component in MEMS is a crystalline material component. So, just to have a feel for what I'm saying, think about the material science aspect of looking at any kind of material, be it an organic material or an alloy or maybe a polymer. So now you know that we could think of relevant length scale that are more important for doing structure property correlations. So if you look at metal and alloys, normally you look at, let's say, length scales in micron lengths, because you then can look into the microstructures which impart specific properties to metals and alloys. If you want to look into structure property correlation in inorganic functional material, then of course you have to look at length scale, which is atomic length scale. So changes in this length scale, if that is being used to detect or to make use of, then the sensitivity could be much higher. Now, this is a very positive thing. So you can go to smaller and smaller dimension and then probably hope for getting a more sensitive reading out of it using a MEMS, for example. But then there are also this drawback because MEMS then produces a very non-linear response, and the interpretation and use of which will be somewhat demanding. So that is quite involved, and then one has to understand that and then make use of it. Normally, MEMS is a coupled system. You have at the least an electrical component coupled to a mechanical component, and the mechanical behavior of MEMS is coupled to the electrical behavior, and so on. So if you want to understand this micro electromechanical system, then you probably have to have well into different fields. For example, there is a table with a list there taken from the reference, which is shown at the bottom, where it says that to understand the MEMS, you probably have to understand the static and dynamic aspect of MEMS. You should and different mechanical engineering aspect, electrical engineering aspect. You have to understand the physics, chemistry, and of course the mathematics involved in order to make use of, understand and then make use of MEMS. You also have these derivatives. Some of these I just mentioned in the previous slide, that you have optics plus MEMS, and then you have to understand that. If you are looking at MEMS in bio application, then you have biotech and MEMS. If you are looking at nanoscale components along with MEMS, then you are looking at nano electromechanical system and so on. So it is a very, very multidisciplinary technology. And then as we go ahead in this presentation, I will try to point out how different people who are interested in MEMS in different ways can still participate, make use of MEMS either for fabrication or for using it to measure something. So you can essentially think of MEMS as a system in which some microelectronics is coupled to some structural elements that are basically sensors and actuators. Now, both microsensors and micro actuators which are present in this MEMS are transducers, and typically you know that you can have a microsensor that can probably convert a measured mechanical signal into an electrical signal, and you can have a micro actuator that basically moves themselves or to another component from one physical state to another, one position to maybe some different position, and together they form the MEMS device and all the characteristics of the MEMS. Now, the performance of MEMS is far, far superior compared to if you look at a electromechanical system that is made using, let's say, macro machining. You have a big device that consists of some sensor which is coupled to some actuators, and then there is some electronics, and all this has been made using macro machining, using bulk materials and so on. You will find that invariably the MEMS device will have far superior performance compared to this bulk electromechanical system that is made using a macro machining technique. Now, the micro actuators in MEMS are more recent compared to the sensors. There are large number of possibilities. I'll come to it a little bit later. So some of these examples I have shown here, and you have this micro valves for control of gas and liquid fuels, and one example is shown here. I'm not going to describe this in detail, but these are some of the examples that where the MEMS have these different micro actuators with different functionalities. You can simply use these MEMS for optical switches or sometime even more. One example is shown here, where you have a micro mirror element as a component of this MEMS, and you have the circuitry which can basically tilt this micro mirror and then focus the light falling on this mirror in different directions. You can have micro pumps to develop positive fluid pressure in medical devices, and for all of these and more, micro actuators has been developed, and it has been shown to work. Also, there are several applications, commercial as well as defense related, which has been already implemented and well known. Many of these biomedical sensors, drug delivery systems, even neurological disorders related to this field devices, MEMS devices that is being used. All these are commercially available. Also, MEMS have application in automotive safety requirement. You will find this airbag systems and so on, where MEMS have already found applications. In defense related applications, MEMS are used in biochemical warfare detection and in inertial system for guidance and navigation, and some of these are shown in this figure. Now, what is that which can be considered as a goal that is there for the micro mechanical system in the present time? And if one wants to have a feel for it, one can go to this, one can follow this MEMSnet web page, where you get lots of relevant information related to MEMS. And according to this, the vision of MEMS is such that this micro sensors, micro actuators, and microelectronics and other technologies, that all this can be integrated in a single microchip. And if they are able to do this, then this would be considered a very important, most important technological breakthrough of the future. And this will be enabled, this will enable the development of smart products by augmenting the computational ability of microelectronics with the perception and control capabilities of microsensors and micro actuators. But currently, the electronics part of the MEMS, these are fabricated by some process, the integrated circuit processes, and the MEMS component. These are fabricated essentially by micro machining. And then when you have this component, then these are integrated in a separate step. So the MEMS fabrication follows that of how integrated circuits are fabricated. And so some issues are relevant for both ICs and MEMS design, which are shown in the slide. But there are, of course, very unique requirements for MEMS that includes the wet environment, 3D nature, and most importantly, moving parts. So these are unique to MEMS fabrication. And when one considers the integration of different fabrication techniques, then one has to consider the limitation of both the fabrications related to specific MEMS and the integrated circuit related processes. Now, I have not put the details of the fabrication techniques. If one wants to look into it, one can always go to this web page or refer to several very good literature resources, books, where you can find a detailed descriptions of the fabrication technique. But if you want to have just an overview, most of the fabrication technique for MEMS involves these three building blocks. That is to that involves firstly to the ability to deposit thin films of material on a substrate, then to apply a patterned mask on top of these films by, let's say, photolithographic imaging, and then the ability to etch the film selectively using the mask. So these are very important building blocks. The MEMS process is usually a structured sequence of these operations to finally form the MEMS device. These details of these processes and different possibilities, one can always find it is a very easily available information. One can go to this web state and you can get updated on this information. There is another recent book that has been published, Fabricating Microelectronic Systems in Open Use Labs by Deborah Munro. And this is a very interesting book where one which describes how anybody who has an interest in fabricating a MEMS device can go about actually fabricating a MEMS device, making use of open use labs in US. For example, there are several labs that allows users to be trained and then making use of these resources which can allow them to make MEMS. So these books actually gives quite a lot of details of how one can go ahead and finally, in fact, make it a MEMS device. Now, if one follows how different technologies are evolving and how the scientific and technological community are responding to this, then it's very likely that similar procedure either already exists in India, which I'm sure you might be already aware. There was also a very interesting talk yesterday, and also it might evolve towards this direction, which is already established in some countries like USA. So reading this book will allow you to probably have an insight on how you can go about if you are interested in making an actual MEMS device. There is a very schematic cartoon of an iterative fabrication process that can result into MEMS. You just start from one stage where you have a silicon wafer on top of which you have a photoresist coat, which basically is a polymeric mixture that might be component that might contain a component that might be sensitive to light. So in the processing steps, you allow some light, UV visible light, to fall on this photoresist coat through a mask. A symbolic glass mask is shown here, and wherever the resist gets exposed to the light, the property of this resist changes, and depending on how it changes, it can be further processed to carry out this wet or dry etch, and that results into a pattern that can be transferred, and then after removing which can be transferred to the substrate here, and then you can go again and repeat this process, and you can then go ahead and complete a MEMS fabrication. Now, so if you decrease the size of this component, somehow we have this information that you can, in principle, achieve a higher sensitivity when you make an electromechanical system. But if you want to really understand this system, then you will find that the fundamental theories that are required to understand the electromechanical systems, which are micro electromechanical systems, this is the same for any electromechanical system. Independent bulk, made up of bulk material components. So these are related to, this could be understood using classical mechanics, the Maxwell's equations, and so on. But if you decrease the size to a range where you will see that there are nano elements, when the size, at least some relevant, any structural aspect of this component, if it is less than 100 nanometer, then you simply call it as a nano material, or the device will be called nano electrochemical system. Then, if you want to understand the system, you have to make use of quantum theory, and quantum theory is the only way you can understand very small particles. Accordingly, the properties of the nano electromechanical system could be in one way more sensitive, or it could also have completely new functionalities. So if you look at recent successes of MEMS technology, you will find that in recent times, there are several of these MEMS technology that are dependent on nanotechnologies to create new products. Now, one very nice example to showcase is that of the automobile SRS airbag accelerometers that are basically manufactured using MEMS technology. So SRS is the supplementary restraint system. They have, however, an issue that if over a long period of time, they have some stiction related issue which affects their long-term reliability. And to overcome that, this particular application a particular kind of nanotechnology, which is called self-assembled monolayer. A SAM coating is routinely used to treat the surface of these MEMS elements, and that prevents the stiction effects from occurring. So together with this nanotechnology, the MEMS technology works, and that has been adopted. So because of such development, one finds that MEMS and nanotechnology are in fact an integral part of the whole. And contribution of each should be considered for a pragmatic approach to designing and fabricating a MEMS device. Now, let me slightly describe this nanofabrication technique. So when you're talking about nanotechnology, you're looking at devices that has been fabricated, and methods and that are available to carry out this fabrication of nano devices. These are only nanofabrication techniques. So nanofabrication technique, you can define this as a method to control, to design, to modify, to manipulate, and to assemble nanoscale components for the purpose of creating a system or for creating a product. If one follows how this nanofabrication technique or technology has evolved over a period of time, then one can clearly see two paths. The one path is towards mass manufacturing of structures and devices, particularly for integrated circuits. This is one inclination, one direction in which nanofabrication technique has evolved. And the other part is towards fabrication of structure and devices which are used for scientific research purposes. So if you look at these two directions and how much development has happened, then on the IC manufacturing side, nowadays you see that 10 nanometer ICs are in pre-production or actually in production state, and this has been making use of highly evolving photolithographic technique. These are very, very specialized and they're hugely expensive. So to carry out the state of art photolithographic technique for fabrication of these very small ICs, the capability to do that rests with very few major companies and very few labs in the world. On the scientific research side, it's a common feature that there's a big diversity and variety of different nanofabrication technique development, and you will see that a large number of publications keep appearing where either the nanofabrication technique is described or is made use for some specific advantage. So this nanofabrication techniques, one can look into all possible nanofabrication techniques that are known, and you can think of these techniques as following a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, or for some economical reason, also a hybrid approach, which involves both the top-down as well as bottom-up approaches. Now, what is this top-down approach? In very simple layman language, you'll find that from a length scale which is much bigger, for example, a bulk material, if you're able to get nanoscale features by reducing the size to nanoscale features, then that would mean that you're looking at a top-down approach. nanoscale is 10 raised to the power minus 9 meter, and the bulk material they could have in scale from millimeter to centimeter to meter and so on. So the bottom-up approach, if you want to describe it in a similar way, then you can think about smaller than nanoscale entities. You look at atomic entities, monatomic gas, you're talking about an angstrom or so sizes, or a molecule, several angstrom. These entities, they come together, the growth can happen under constrained situations so that you stop with nano size somehow, or by self-assembly to a nanoscale feature, forming, let's say, a nanomaterial or a device. And this approach is the bottom-up approach, where molecules can come together because of self-assembly and create a nano-featured nanomaterial. So, top-down approaches, this basically refers to different kinds of lithographic techniques. So, if we are talking about top-down approaches, essentially for nanofabrication techniques, we are talking about lithographic techniques. For bottom-up approaches, one can think about self-assembly, for example, or even in some cases, you can bring together atom by atom on a surface using a scanning probe, for example, an AFM or STM tip, and then you can assemble that into a nanoscale material. But essentially, bottom-up approaches make use of materials like nanoparticles. We can think about die-block copolymers. These are block copolymers, and you can synthesize them in a very there are methods known where you can synthesize a designer two block polymers where property of one block will be very different from the other, and that could lead to nanostructures. You have biomolecules like DNA that can self-assemble, be brought together in an assembly pattern. And these kind of approaches essentially forms what is the bottom-up approaches for nanofabrication technique. Then there are these hybrid approaches. This is an integration of top-down as well as bottom-up approaches, which provide an alternative approach to reduce the cost or to create very complex architectures. So you can, so that kind of approaches also exist in nanofabrication techniques that are known. But it all started with this person shown in the figure here, Jack Kilby. He was the inventor of integrated circuits, a Nobel laureate for this invention. So he conceived the planar processing method, which became the foundation of modern integrated circuit manufacturing technology and is associated with microfabrication as well as nanofabrication. If you look at it, there are broadly three very distinct characteristics to this planar process. The first very distinct characteristic is individual parts or structures. These are formed by planar patterning. And this planar patterning process is essentially consisting of two stages, patterning and then pattern transfer. So, so a pattern is formed by lithography on a layer of, let's say, energy sensitive polymer. Often these are called resists, which are coated on the planar supporting substrate. The resist layer is exposed and then developed, and the developed resist relief pattern is then transferred on the planar substrate either by etching or by adding another film which can be deposited over it. So by this way of fabrication, the dimension of a structure is no longer limited by the capability of the machining tool, but it is now depending only on the resolution of a lithographic system. So that's the first characteristic. And the second one is that the planar process always takes place in 2D, and they make 2D planar structure. You can call it, let's say, more than 2D structure when superimposition of a series of 2D structure in vertical direction is done. So here in the figure, you see an assembly of an individual components, which is realized at different stages of planar processing. And this actually is a complete mechanical system which was fabricated by this national lab in USA called Sandia National Lab, which used a specific kind of planar fabrication process to achieve this MEMS. The third characteristic feature of this planar fabrication is that it is a batch process. So a batch of device or devices is made on some planar substrate through many steps of processes, and all fabrications are done at wafer level, but hundreds of integrated circuits are made simultaneously with the repeated lithography, etching, and deposition process. You can see a cartoon of this process. You will find this again and again coming whenever you are describing a lithographic process. So you have a substrate with a coating, then you have some light exposed to the resist through a mask, and then you have a development stage, and after the development stage, you can transfer the pattern to the substrate, either by etching, then you get the pattern like this, or by film deposition, when you get a pattern like this, when you have removed the sacrificial resist layer. So when you use light in this way, in all photolithography, then you can achieve this kind of fabrication process. And so far, using light for photolithography, the highest resolution which is possible in conventional lithography, employing with a wavelength of, let's say, 248 nanometer laser, is related to, or is related to this particular energy. So I will show you that when you're using this light, monochromatic coherent light from a laser source, then there is a limitation on the resolution that you can achieve on the nanofabricated feature, which is related to this energy of the wavelength. But in practice, the highest resolution conventional photography used is used in all high volume integrated IC manufacturing process, and the highest resolution so far is the energy that comes, the wavelength that is used for the light source with the wavelength of around 248 nanometers. So if you use a conventional photolithography, the light source, you can make it more energetic, you pick an appropriate light with a low wave number, and you get higher resolution. And the highest resolution that is possible using conventional photolithography, that is used to produce high volume integrated circuits, that is presently around 248 nanometers. But then this particular line, because this is the direction in which commercial development is ongoing. The latest nanolithography that is possible is through the so-called extreme ultraviolet nanolithographic technique. And this technique, or this lithographic technique, this uses a wavelength of light with a wavelength of approximately 30 nanometer. And one would recognize that there is no suitable laser known that can operate near this wavelength. So extreme ultraviolet nanolithography that uses wavelength around 30 nanometer, 10 to 14 nanometer, and this is basically because of the availability of this light source and also the availability of the relevant optics. And this company Samsung has begun mass production. Hello? Is there any? I'm not able to hear properly. Hello? Sorry, I'm not able to hear. Can you just put a chat message? Maybe I can have a look. Ma'am, should I proceed? I am not able to understand what was spoken. I just realized somebody is speaking, but I'm just hearing
No,
some
sir.
noise.
No, sir, you can continue, sir.
Okay. So this Samsung company has announced mass production of ICs which are around 7 nanometer in size. So, and they announced that they will start shipping this first 7 to 6 nanometer based mobile chips from V1 line in one of these production line they have in Korea. And so this has been almost the state of art production possibility, and this is possible only for in a very limited places today. There are lots of technological hurdles for this nanolithographic technique. To start with the source, and then at such very high energy, literally all the material starts absorbing it. So one has to use reflective optics, and there are specific kind of reflective optics that will work with some efficiency. So all this, and there are several more there are very challenging technological constraint, and Samsung has overcome that, and now they're mass producing this very small sized nanofabricated ICs using this extreme ultraviolet nanolithography technique. So I was talking to you about the limitation in the type of nano sizes that you can achieve when you're using a light source for carrying out lithographic fabrication. So basically the resolution that you can achieve using a light source is related to the wavelength of the light and to some other constant numerical aperture and some constant that you can roughly take this value as lambda by 2. And so if you see the visible light lambda approximately, let's say 500 nanometer, then you will see that the resolution is limited to roughly around 250 nanometer or so. If you go to extreme ultraviolet and let's say soft X-ray light, then the wavelength can range from 1 to 50 nanometer. And then you can see that this gives a very high resolution, and the bottleneck with the conventional photolithographic technique is really overcome when you going for this extreme ultraviolet nanolithography. Now, since I want to clearly show different kind of usage that different nanofabrication techniques are being put to, and I just now described the development that has happened in the commercial arena where they have used photolithography, and then they have achieved extremely high resolution and small size of ICs in mass production when they are doing this extreme ultraviolet lithography. There are, of course, other lithographic technique which might not be used for the production in industrial for commercial production of ICs and so on, but they are very, very suitable for research. Now, all the lithographic technique can be classified into 3 different kinds. So you can call it projection lithography, the type of lithography just now that I described, that is all projection lithography. One can distinguish projection lithography from probe lithography and mold lithography, for example. There are some cartoons of this shown here. You have this projection lithography. I described this process just now. You have a light source which falls on a substrate on which there is a resist coated through a mask that has a, so that a pattern is transferred on the resist, and from there you can transfer it on the substrate. And this is a parallel patterning process, which means that all the features that are contained in the mask, they are imaged simultaneously. So that means that this process is very fast, and that is the reason why most of the commercial interests related to lithographic techniques are all projection lithography. The second type of lithography, this is the probe lithography. In probe lithography, you can have a probe that can be used to create a pattern. This probe can be a solid probe. You can think about a scaling probe, scanning probe lithography. You can think about an AFM tip, or you can think about an STM tip if you're thinking about a conducting substrate where you can create patterns, or you can think about non-solid probes. You can think about focused electron beam and so on, or focused ion beams and so on. So all these kind of lithography, these are part of so-called probe lithography. Now, when you look at this probe lithography, this is a sequential patterning process, which means that you make the pattern sequence in a serial way, one after the other. So it has, all probe lithography has a low throughput. It's a low throughput patterning process. So these at the best could be used for quality control related purposes in industry, but often it is used in scientific research, because if you consider the resolution that is possible, then some of these probe lithography can have very, very high resolution. Then you have this mold lithography. These are a very different kind of lithographic technique where you make use of patterns which are replicated using molds. So mold lithography includes nano imprint, hot embossing, micro injection molding, and things like that. So often you find that some of these processes are have a reasonably high throughput, and they have very reasonable resolution as well. So often these are quite popular both in research as well as in some tech industries. So I could, in principle, put all possible techniques. I have not put all possible techniques related to lithography here, but you could do this exercise with all known possible lithographic technique, then you will find that you can separate this lithographic technique as conventional lithographic technique and unconventional lithographic technique. And when you look at the conventional lithographic technique, you have examples like photolithography and so on, which are projection lithography. They are limited by the Rayleigh equation for resolution. We just now saw that the resolution is roughly around the wavelength divided by 2. And here we have seen this extreme ultraviolet lithography that is really the state of art for making use of projection lithography. So that is one. You have scanning probe lithography. These are all probe lithographies. You have X-ray lithography, electron beam lithography, and so on. So all this lithography, you can clearly distinguish them using the parameters related to resolution as well as the parameter related to the speed at which they can be used to result in a device. So whether they have a sequential process involved, that means that the speed will be less, or they are parallel processes where simultaneously a large number of devices can be made using a projection lithography technique. So the basic operational principle here is expose an appropriate material to electromagnetic radiation, which introduces a latent modification. It could be a difference in solubility on the resist material. Then this latent modification subsequently developed into relief structure through etching. When the probe tips do the writing, the lithography can be simply called scanning probe lithography. So you have different kinds of tips that can be used in scanning probe lithography. In unconventional lithography, you have nano imprint lithography, you have soft molding, you have capillary force lithography, you have different soft lithographic technique that has been made quite popular. These are very economically viable process, and this can be usually applicable to large area patterning. So these are some of these very lucrative, very nice advantages of some of these techniques, and that's why it's being used. This image shows the resolution difference, resolution in different lithographic technique as a function of productivity. So resolution in nanometer area, the productivity as area throughput given in micrometer square per hour, and then you can put different techniques at this, and you see at very extreme low left you have STM. So you can think about an ultra high vacuum condition in which a surface at extremely low temperature is used to carry out atom manipulation. So you can achieve many things. In fact, if you see, if you are thinking about a normal synthesis or preparation of material, that is very different from synthesis of same material by bringing the reactants in atomic numbers on a cold and let's say metallic surface, where using a tip you bring these molecules or atoms together and make this reaction to happen at a very low temperature. So you create such devices and so on. So it is having extremely high resolution, but the speed is very, very low. So you can imagine that this can take extremely long time to make a device. If you go to extremely right and top, so you have this optical step and repeat reduction printing and so on, which has some resolution which is given here and has a very high throughput. Similarly, you have you can compare the Gaussian E-beam lithography on a resist, whenever you use electron beam, often you find that you are using this polymer methyl methacrylate as a resist, and then it has a resolution which is in between these two extremes. You can do that. Oh. You can do that for all the lithographic technique that you come across when you try to find out what is the maximum resolution that is possible and roughly the time it takes to make these devices. Okay, so making these nano devices can also be useful to carry out experiment. So if you could, for example, seek a particular MEMS device so that you can measure a property that is relevant to your research. There are so many examples. I just randomly picked one example, and this is related to design of a nanoscale device which can be used to demonstrate the so-called Coulomb blockade. Now, a nano-sized model system to study the nanoscale electronics, such as single electron tunneling, that can be made, and it's shown here. So this is really a nanoscale device where you see the center portion and these different features of the structures which basically form an island and the electrodes. This device is made using an STM tip. This is by scanning probe lithography using an STM tip on a silicon surface which has been passivated by hydrogen, and use an STM tip to dissolve this hydrogen, and by doing that you get this feature. Now, in such a device, in order to observe charging effects in electronic transport measurement, the thermal energy has to be lower than the change in charging energy by single electron transfer. So, which means that since at thermal energy at room temperature, when you calculate Kb into T, Kb being the Boltzmann constant, you arrive at an energy of 0.025 electron volt. The size of the island then should be less than 10 nanometer in order that the change in charging energy, which is given by this equation here, where Q is the charge and the C is the island capacitance, this should satisfy that the KBT, the room temperature of the thermal energy given by Kb into T, is less than this charging energy. So under this condition, the electrons tunnel between the electrode and the island one by one, leading to a well-defined charge state. Now, there is this cartoon picture shown of the single electron transfer device here, and you can compare this with a normal transistor, which is a cartoon of which is shown here. A channel is replaced by a small dot. The dot is separated from the source and drain by thin insulator, and an electron can tunnel in two steps. It goes from source to dot and from dot to drain. The gate voltage, which is shown here, Vg, this is controlled by change by the charge which is on the gate dot capacitor, which is also shown in the diagram. Now, when you sweep the gate voltage, the charge Qg on the gate dot capacitor given by Cg, this also changes. And To add one electron, you will require a voltage change given by this equation, charge of electron divided by Cg. And since Cg is given by this equation, you can manipulate this. The source drain conduction G is 0 for most gate voltages, because putting an extra or even one extra electron on the dot, this would cost too much of Coulomb energy, and this is called the Coulomb blockade. Now, electrons can hop from the onto the dot only at a gate voltage, where the number of electrons on the dot flip-flops between n and n plus 1. And if you take a time average one, then this will be n plus half n any time. So the spacing between the half integer conduction peak is shown in the figure here, and that can tell you how you can measure the charges, the electron. Now, the condition for the Coulomb blockade I have described before. I'll just summarize it here. The Coulomb energy, which is given here, needs to exceed the thermal energy. And then the residence time, delta T, this is given by this equation. The electron on the dot needs to be so long that the corresponding energy uncertainty, which is given by this equation, delta is E is equal to H over RC, this should be less than the Coulomb energy. So that condition leads to the condition for tunnel resistance between the dot and the source drain. So when this transfer happens, the gate voltage shifts these energy levels up and down, which is shown in the figure, and makes it possible to access levels with different electron numbers, let's say n. So if you design a device of that kind and you want to test a superconducting material, then you can make a device. The characteristic of this is shown in the figure, and when you measure the conductance peak, then you will see as you change the temperature, you can see that the charge carriers are one electron charge at temperatures, let's say 300 millikelvin, and when you cool the system, then you will find, looking at this data, that below the superconducting transition temperature, when the material becomes superconductor, and the charge carriers are having a charge of 2 electrons charge, and indicating that this involves the Cooper pairs, the superconductor. So this is a very, very nice experiment that makes use of nanofabrication in order to demonstrate the phase transition from a non-superconducting state to a superconducting state. So this is one of several of these experiments that can be done in research using a nanofabricated device. Okay, so with that, I will come back to some of my interest, part of the research that has progressed in a way where I seek an experiment using, let's say, a MEMS device or so. But the motivation for carrying out this kind of experiment basically comes from some of the results that has diffraction experiments at the core of this experiment. So basically what I do is that I take some functional materials. These are of different kind of materials. So I have worked on magnetic material, I have worked on metallic alloys, I worked on inorganic materials and used different diffraction techniques and modeled these atomic level arrangement, symmetrical arrangement of these atomic entities so as to carry out a more definitive structure property correlation. So I measure some properties and then I look into the structure, and if I'm able to figure out a more definitive structure property correlation, then I can evolve or go towards a direction where I can experiment small subtle changes using a MEMS device which are sensitive to these kind of changes. So let me tell about one particular experiment that we did, and that involves an oxide dispersed strengthened steel sample. So the way these samples are made, I've just put a cartoon figure just to show you how the samples are made. Now you start with the alloy powder or a pure iron powder along with some oxide, in this case yttria, Y2O3, and then you carry out high energy ball milling. Then you consolidate and then put through a hot isostatic press, and this results in this hot consolidation. Then the extruded bar is then again worked, then heat treated to get the final sample. So we have these samples that have different composition. So I will call it sample 1, sample 2, and sample 3. Sample 1 is a pure iron sample in which you have this yttria that was processed to get this so-called ODS steel. There was another sample where you had, in addition to iron, around 0.28% of titanium. And the third sample was that of a stainless steel sample where you have this 14% chromium. The chromium imparts this property that stainless steel doesn't corrode. And that again, all of these samples have this yttria to the same extent, so 0.3 volume percent. Now, when you get this sample, after this processing, what happens is in the metal matrix, because of very small solubility of this yttria, when you do this hot consolidation process, these precipitate, and then you will have a sample in which in the metal matrix you will have nano-sized particles of these oxides, and because of this, the property of this steel changes in a very favorable way. For example, the strength becomes higher, its heat resistance property even to at a very high temperature that increases, and these steel are they have very important application in nuclear reactors. So we started with this sample, and my interest was to see whether we could have some details about this yttria, the role that yttria is playing in affecting the property of this ODS alloy, and whether we can detect it in some way. So, of course, this is not an easy thing to do. So we ended up applying for some instrument time at the spallation neutron source in Oak Ridge National Lab in USA, where they have this particular instrument called WOMAC, and that can be used to analyze the diffraction data and look for changes in nano length scale features of this sample. So basically, the way this spallation source experiment works is you take the spallation source, the experiment is such that the neutron pulse from the spallation source falls on the sample, and then it reaches a detector, and the flight path L is known, and so from the wavelength, it can be related in this way, and ultimately you can relate the despacing in the crystalline material to the time flight path in this way. So the actual experimental setup is such that the pulse neutron comes in this direction, falls on the sample, and these are all detectors that are arranged from which this diffraction data can be measured. This is the actual setup. So what we found was that we could actually see the difference in data even for this very small Yttria particle in this ODS still. So we carried out what is called a pair distribution function analysis, and then we see that the way this the intensity decreases as a function of this distance. So all the peaks here basically tells the distance between atoms. You start with any atom and go radially outwards, and any atom that you encounter, the distance between that two appears as peak here. And the difference in the blue and red plot here, which are the pure ion and the yttria doped ion, that tells us that even a very small fraction of yttria that affects this diffraction pattern. So this is a motivation to look forward to looking at the effect of yttria in some way when looking at the structure. So that was the motivation. What we did was that we recognized that the structure description of this oxide, yttria, a cartoon of this is shown on the right, in terms of polyhedra and in a quantitative way, so that the structure description is exactly the same as described in terms of the space group symmetry, unit cell lattice parameters, and the atomic positions, and so on. Then this enables making correlation between the local distortions of all kind to the bulk strain in this kind of material. So once we recognize this, we analyze this structure. In fact, we have successfully done it for several class of functional oxide. There are around 80 atoms in this unit cell. This happens to be a cubic unit cell, and you can describe these in different ways. One particular way to describe this is in terms of these two different polyhedra, which are octahedras, and one of them has certain degrees of freedom, which are more than this other octahedra. It can be tilt rotated along this axis, and it has this radius r and an angle between these bonds, which can vary. And we can model this in a very nice way. We can do diffraction experiment, we can do rigid body refinements, and we can get this parameter quantitatively so that we can model very minute changes in this material. So for example, in the bulk yttria, we again carried out a pair distribution function analysis. Each peak represent on an average picking any atom and then going radially outwards how many atoms you encounter. And we did some techniques, and we found that as you go away from an atom, so that you're describing bigger and bigger size from a very small atomic length scale, starting from angstrom level to, let's say, a nano dimension, you are able to monitor changes. And so, cut this discussion short, what we found is that we could use this model, and once we have this model working, then we can make use of this kind of analysis to create sensors. So presently we have this funded program, the self-funded program, where we are creating two different such oxide phases which are having a common interface, so that in principle, once you make it, you can affect one phase by affecting another phase. And for that, this can, so once you are able to get such functional elements, then the only way to characterize them further would be to look forward to preparing a suitable MEMS device and making use of such a device to look into very subtle changes in some of these properties. So this is initiation that we have started. It's still going on, so there is not much I can describe at this time, but I will stop with this. So we are really able to see changes that in principle, based on this modeling, we can correlate with how changes happen at very small length scale when you're looking at length scales in atomic level. And then when we are able to relate it to a specific property, then it is possible to measure these properties of, let's say, a nanocomposite consisting of two oxide phases using a MEMS device. Okay, so I'll stop with this. Thank you for your attention, please.
Participants, if you have any queries, you can raise now. Ma'am.
Participants, do you have any questions? Nice session, feedback, very great session. Some comments, the feedback, the participants have posted, sir. But there are no questions.
Okay, in that case, I will thank Dr. Vimla ma'am, and maybe then I'll close my session. Thank you very much.
Ashia.
Yes,
Over to Ashia.
yes. Good afternoon, all. I, on behalf of Head of Department of E&I SRM IST, I'm here to present the vote of thanks to the speaker, Dr. Anthony Arora, sir, for today's. I would like to thank you, sir, for virtual visiting and enlightening with us your research work in materials and fabrication techniques. It really gives us a deep insight into the topic and also reveals some interesting facts, sir. I would like to express our sincere thanks for giving an excellent coverage to MEMS fabrication, MEMS fabrication and its classifications and approaches. Pretty sure, sir, the precious knowledge that you gave us will definitely help us in our future study. Also, thank you to the faculties present here for paying your attention and learning. Thank you all. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.